Registered attendees, the recording will be made available to you following the webinar. So you can request that, or we may email it to all of you. So just so you know, and we will begin recording now. Great. And then a couple of administrative items just for you guys to just to help you understand how this is going to work. So you will be able to submit questions during the discussion using your webinar function tool on your screen, and then we'll collect all of those questions and address them in the second portion of today's webinar. I'm just seeing if there's anything else. Oh yeah, so we should move on to the disclaimer, as Ammar mentioned. So John, can you move over to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I'll read this out, but please just take note of this. The presentation and information contained herein are provided without prejudice basis and does not constitute, nor should be construed to constitute, legal advice or guarantee, offer, representation, or warranty on behalf of Toromont or Alectra. The panel members will be offering suggestions to several possible customer scenarios. The answers given by the panel members should be used as a guide. All right, so we can begin. And I'd like to begin by introducing our two other panelists today. Our first guest speaker is Ron Cocking, who is one of my colleagues at Toromont. Ron is the EPG Market Manager for Toromont and has 25 years experience in business development and strategic account management. Ron has very in-depth understanding of the energy market and has been instrumental in developing and implementing a number of distributed generation projects over the years. So Ron, thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you.
My pleasure.
And then our second guest speaker, who you may remember from our last Let's Talk Energy, our first Let's Talk Energy, is Ammar Nawaz. And Ammar is the Vice President of Distributed Energy Solutions with Alectra, and he is responsible for Electra's commercial initiatives. Ammar, prior to joining Electra, spent over a decade at Hydro One across various technical, operational, as well as business development roles. So Ammar, thank you for being here. We appreciate your time and input.
Thanks, Megan. Great to be back.
Thanks, Ammar. So John, moving to the next slide, we'll get into some of the questions today. So our first question I'm going to direct at you, Ammar, and if you don't mind letting us know your thoughts on how the recent changes made to the Ontario budget impact electricity and global adjustment costs.
Thanks, Megan. Before I begin, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you and your families are all keeping well and safe. These are indeed very challenging times, and I wish everybody the best. We just have to observe all the guidelines that are out there and just sort of ride the wave the second time as well. Hopefully, we're going to come ahead. So with respect to the question, Megan, this has been a major development over the last week or 10 days. And there's a lot of things that have a immediate impact as well as long-term impact on electricity pricing in the province. Just to provide a little bit of context, I think it was not a surprise when the government came out with the change that you just talked about on November 5th as part of their budget plans. The government had kicked off an industrial rate review, I believe, earlier last year. And also, as you know, the government had put ICI on a pause for about a year, which we were terming ICI hiatus, enabling the Class A customers to focus more on their recovery as opposed to chasing peaks during the pandemic. So by any stretch, it was not a surprise. I think a lot of people were expecting that there were changes coming down the pipe. However, it did create an environment of uncertainty among the industrial customers. And there were a lot of theories that were floating around. There were a lot of speculation, and as much as it affected the developers who were providing third-party solutions for whether it's enabling you to mitigate your global adjustment charges or provide other services behind the meter, I would like to think that Class A customers themselves probably needed this clarity more than anybody else. So many of the Class A customers and the industrial customers are looking at this as a positive sign that now there is clarity. There is a direction that has been made clear, and I think in the budget document it does also point to the ICI program as potentially a helpful tool in combination with other things that the government is doing. So I do recommend that if you have the time, definitely refer to page 97 and page 99 of the budget document. It's a good read. So with respect to the impact, I think what took a lot of people by surprise was not so much the change, but rather the quantum of the change. And the change was the government has decided to take a large portion of renewable energy contracts, namely wind, solar, and bioenergy contracts. I believe 80%, 85% of their global adjustment contribution over to the Treasury. What that has done is it has had an impact of approximately 23% reduction in overall GEA pool, if you will. Now, again, all of these numbers are indicative, illustrative, and they're notional. So this reduction in global adjustment has had, I believe, on average, as per how the budget document read it, 14% decline for Class B business customers, not RPP customers, but Class B business customers, and roughly 16% on average for Class A customers on their bills. So obviously, it has an impact on the ICI program just by the virtue of, you have dropped this big pool of global adjustment by 23% and roughly moving 3 billion to 3.1 billion, I believe that's how the math works out, over to the Treasury going forward each year, bringing you back to a global adjustment level that was, people are calling it pre-2016, 2015 numbers. It has an impact on the ICI program. And the impact is as follows. I think the rolling average that we were dealing with when it came to ICI program, where industry felt comfortable, was more like $550,000 a megawatt year as a benefit for chasing the peaks under the ICI construct. Now, if you look at the math, that number has dropped significantly from 550 to 450 to 480. Again, the way this actual number is determined is highly specific on a number of different factors. It takes into account the demand, the supply, the peak in that given year, but that's what you're looking at. So it is a substantial drop from 550 to call it, for simplicity, 450. But then the question is the value proposition still strong for the customers to continue to participate in the ICI program? And I think if you look at it from that perspective, an answer would be yes, it does appear so that way. You still have roughly 80% of the value that you had before up for savings through effective load mitigation behind the meter. I hope that provides a little bit of clarity.
No, that's excellent. Thank you. That's great. John, can we move to the next question? Ammar, I'll also direct this one at you. Can you talk about where you feel the cost of electricity is in the province of Ontario is headed?
Thanks, Megan. That's a tough question. It's a difficult question. I'm sure we will all like to have access to that crystal ball and see where the costs in the province are headed. I'll definitely give it my best shot to sort of demystify this. And I think what we need to do is we need to look at the broader trends within the industry and then take our cues from that to see, where are the costs headed in the province and what does that look like? What does history tell us in the last 10, 15 years? and where do we see the cost going in the future? So from that lens and from that prism, if we take a step back and revisit, what was the genesis of a lot of these costs in the province? So Ontario ended up building a lot of generation, and I think back in the early 2000s, we were anticipating tremendous amount of load growth and recognizing that you can't build generation on demand instantaneously. You have to plan for it, plan for the infrastructure years and decades in advance. So Ontario embarked on this journey to build substantial generation in the province, and I think we have, I might be wrong, but to the order of 35 to 40,000 megawatts of installed capacity, whereas our peak has continued to decline over the last 10 years, if you notice. So, which it really, what it really means is you have a lot of fixed cost in the system, the costs that have to be paid for somehow. And what we've also seen as a result of falling demand, both peak demand as well as volumetric demand in the province, you have, far fewer kilowatt hours, if you will, to amortize the cost over. So naturally, the impact is that your cost per unit goes up, and that's exactly what we've seen in the province of Ontario. So in addition to that, pandemic and some of the load decline that we had experienced as a result of the pandemic did not help. It actually further exacerbated the issue in the province, where the cost climbed even further. Once again, you have fewer kilowatt hours to amortize. So that's what I like people to think about. You have fixed system, fixed cost, higher consumption you have, naturally lower electricity prices you can anticipate. The lower consumption you have, the higher the prices are going to be. It's a gross simplification, but I think it definitely sums up the picture nicely. So with that in mind, when we look out into the future, definitely this reduction in the global adjustment, as I articulated before, has had significant impact on the cost. But let's keep in mind, we do have an aging system in Ontario. On the T&D infrastructure side, the T&D costs, again, are also rising with every passing day. Furthermore, you have Pickering retirement that's coming up, and according to some long-term forecast, again, forecasts, you have to take everything with a grain of salt, but they are anticipating that Hope, Ontario hourly energy price, is expected to rise because they expect more and more gas generation to fill the gap in the peaking demand. And typically, gas is the most expensive, and they set the clearing price in the ISO market as well. So long-term view, I think where we are at today relative to where we're going to be over the next 5 to 10 years, I expect the cost to continue to rise, although we've had a little bit of a reset. But I think it's only a matter of time that we're going to catch up to some of these numbers that we saw in 2017, 2018. Again, 2020 was an exception. You had substantially lower consumption in a few months, and that drove the pricing through the roof. But more normally, 2017, 2018, 2019 numbers are likely to be met again. The reasons are very simple. Once again, you have a fixed system. You're moving costs around within the system. Moving to treasury is actually taking costs out of the system, so that's definitely a reset. But global adjustment, I think, on the most part, has been an upward trend. So it does continue to rise. If nothing else, just a mere factor of inflation adjustment, you do see a hike. In addition to, you have T&D infrastructure across the board in Ontario, which will at the very least rise at the rate of inflation. And then you have Hope, which the commodity price, the marginal cost of commodity in the province is also expected to rise. So that's how I would look at it.
Excellent. Okay. Thanks, Ammar. That's great. So John, if you don't mind, move to the next slide, please. So Ron, we're gonna direct this one your way. Given what Ammar has just explained to us and electricity pricing continue to escalate, do you mind talking about some of the ways customers can get ahead of these costs?
Yeah, thanks, Megan, and thanks to everyone who joined the call today. We appreciate your participation, and to express as well on Ammar's point. We hope that everyone's remaining safe and taking caution and keeping families safe during this unprecedented time. And so we really appreciate, because there are differences in how we deliver our messages and converse with one another. So we appreciate everybody taking some time out to join us with this. And thanks, Ammar, for some really excellent points on the first two questions. And they help to stress what the risk is to customers out there of the electrical grid. So as Ammar very aptly pointed out, there's a change that's come, and it does have an effect on the cost of electricity, and whether that's a long-term or a short-term effect. As Ammar pointed out, we're not certain at this point in time, but we do expect that it's a reset, and that electricity will continue to rise. There's an excellent publication from the Association of Major Power Consumers of Ontario that outlines the structure of where a lot of the debt that goes into the global adjustment lies. And I suggest, if you have an opportunity to go to their site, have a look at it. No, it will change obviously with the modification from the budget, but it's still fairly apt in what it tells us will happen with the cost of electricity in Ontario as a result of growing global adjustment. So Ammar pointed out, we expect a change, roughly a reduction from our nominal $550,000 per megawatt per year down to between 450 and 480. Still a sizable number that impacts organizations. And so there's always folks looking to understand, how do we mitigate these costs? How do we achieve a number that our organization can tolerate and keep moving forward, and being productive here in the Ontario market. So there are opportunities to reduce that energy cost, and the ICI program is an excellent opportunity. So that program, what I would say as a result of last week's conversation would provide to me is, it really removes a lot of the uncertainty and the ambiguity that we've had over the past few months. As the government's been talking about making changes, everyone pauses and holds and says, well, wait, is the ICI program going to disappear, and will I not have that as an option any longer? I would say that this gives us some comfort that the ICI program is here for some time, and then therefore it's worth investigating as an option. So how can I control my energy costs here? Number of ways. Obviously, the simplest and most cost effective is use less electricity. So many organizations, the first step they'll take is they'll go out and investigate ways of reducing the cost of, or the consumption of electricity at their facilities. They'll go for efficiency plans. They'll reduce, they'll change the lighting out in their facilities. They'll find ways of managing motor loads through VFDs. And this is great, but it will have a limitation as to, where it can take you. So what's the next thing I can do? So the next thing I can do is try and reduce my consumption during the 5 peaks that are identified in Ontario. And so in order to do that, I've got a couple of options. And one of those options could be curtail my use during that time frame. So shut down systems are not required. So if I have a large press that I can operate outside of the peak hours, perhaps I run that press during that time frame. If I can turn lights off in certain areas, I turn lights off. Different things that I can do to affect it. We have heard of facilities that actually shut down during the peak period and then restart. But the impact of these solutions are that they affect your overall production costs, right? So if I'm curtailing my load, if I'm doing these things to slow down my production or affect my production, then I'm actually going to cause myself some losses or some expenses that affect me differently. And I'm not sure that many folks have gone out and done the measurement to be exact on that, but there is there is an impact, and particularly it would affect those folks that are just-in-time manufacturing. So a lot of automotive OEMs, they manufacture and produce on the time frame that it just delivers as it needs to be delivered, and they can't afford to shut down production for any period of time. They have to meet contracts. And if they fail to meet the contracts, then that has a significant impact. So the other options are self-generate or take myself off the grid through using a storage methodology. And both are appropriate solutions. The latter has some challenges in that, as more and more folks engage in the Class A ICI program, what happens is we're seeing a flattening of the peak. So you have to be attentive now to what others are doing. So I have to anticipate as I'm heading into the peak, what are the other Class A customers doing? And if they all start curtailing or generating, does the peak dissipate and suddenly it's not a peak and it drops off? And when it drops off, everybody pulls away, and then perhaps we get what we call a shadow peak, and it re-engages and comes up again. If I'm running with a storage solution, I'm probably able to manage that first peak, but the second peak becomes a challenge. So the other methodology is to generate off of gas reciprocating engines or turbines and shave the peak using that. It gives a lot more latitude as to the timeframes that I can manage, and therefore I've got a better chance of connecting with all 5 peaks. So really the options are, as I said, Megan, curtail, reduce your electricity consumption, or generate behind the meter and take yourself off grid during the peaks.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Ron. John, can you move to the next slide? Ron, so again, I'll direct this at you. Given what you've explained, if behind the meter solutions have all these benefits, why are we not seeing more customers implement these type of projects?
Sure. So, yeah, truthfully, when we look at it, the thought of saving, $450,000, $480,000 per megawatt hour would seem very attractive. Your first inclination table would be to say, yeah, this is a great opportunity for you guys to control your energy costs, probably one of the biggest expenses your organization has. And so why do they balk at moving forward with the project? And I would say, there's probably about 3 key pieces that I identify typically. Number one being the cost. So the cost of a distributed energy resource is significant. So many of these facilities are, because they're Class A customers, tend to be multi-megawatt facilities, and the cost of embedding a generation or a storage solution is very significant. So organizations tend to not be willing to spend budget on projects drive their core competencies. So if I'm a hospital, my focus should be on healthcare and taking care of my patients, and I should be spending money to drive that. If I'm a university, my obligation is to maintain a safe campus and educate my students. So again, I'm not particularly looking at spending money on anything but doing that. And the same thing with manufacturing. I'm here to produce a product, whatever my widget is, and that's what I need to be focusing on. And I don't really want to spend budget to improve my product or improve my revenue streams for a cost-cutting measure. And so we tend to run into that. And then on top of that, the return on the capital may not fit in with many of these organizations. And where we notice this more significantly is with the manufacturing sector. And they typically have contracts that run 2, 3, 4 years, and then there's a possibility of a product change or discontinuation. And so they want to keep their return on the expense inside that window, and it's very challenging. So they tend to pull away from it. Okay. The next thing would be the risk of it. So again, these are customers that are typically focused in healthcare, education, the manufacturing. They're not energy facilities. They're not designed to operate an engine per se, or track the peaks and follow everything. So peak shaving requires that an organization shaves all 5 peaks in a given year to return. So every time I miss a peak, my savings are reduced by 20%. So this will significantly affect the benefit and the return of the project. And again, if we think about organizations that are sensitive to the return on capital, this becomes pretty challenging for them to say, yeah, this is a great project for us to move forward with, or to get the mind share of the executive within the organization to say, yeah, we are willing to spend the money here. And then, as we discussed earlier, the possibility of the ICI program going away did exist. So, there's no contractual obligation from the province when it comes to the ICI program. It's just a program. So I'm at risk when I participate if the program is canceled at any point in time. Now, as I said a few moments ago, one of the things that we feel as a result of last week's announcement is that, we're that uncertainty and ambiguity has pulled back from that disappearance of the program. So we're more confident that this program is going to be around for quite some time. And then the other alternative is if I pick the right asset and the right technology, if the ICI program was to go away for whatever reason, I should be prepared with the technology that allows me to, work behind the meter on a longer term. So now I can deflect the cost of those expenses by self-generating behind the meter. And then the last piece I would say is core competency. So, these organizations, tend not to be experts in power production, and they may have facilities folks that take care of this stuff. They might manage boilers, they might manage standby gensets, but this is a bit of a different animal altogether. And the key for these organizations, as I said, is focus on your areas of expertise. If you're a manufacturer, manufacture. If you're a healthcare organization, focus on healthcare. If you're an educational institution, focus on education. So it's hard for them to deflect from what they're doing. And then who in the organization becomes responsible for managing the generation asset and tracking the peaks. So now you put the burden on somebody within the organization, and if they miss any of the peaks, it becomes problematic. So our view is there's a way around this. There are partners out there and that work with us to help put together projects we call managed energy services. So it takes the risk and responsibility away from the organization and allows them to have the benefit of that reduced energy costs.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Ron. That's really informative. John, can you move to the next slide, please? So kind of a good segue, Ron, into what we're discussing, but I'll give it back to the mic back to Ammar to address this. So Ammar, what are some options available to customers who haven't yet moved forward with, the type of solutions Ron was talking about because of those barriers that he just discussed?
Yeah, thanks, Megan. Thanks, Ron, for really setting the stage for me. I think it was, you hit all the key points there. So if I could just build off of that, Megan, and add to it, I think as Ron pointed out, it's definitely a financial consideration. It's a huge one. Obviously, these investments behind the meter, although in the long run are, very beneficial and provide a whole host of benefits, but they do require a upfront capital investment on behalf of the customer if they were to go ahead and do it on their own. And in this environment where capital is scarce and companies are focused on their core business, so if you were a hospital, you would much rather take that money and invest more in your core infrastructure, whether it's your X-ray machines or operation theaters and other equipment, as opposed to buying a brand new CHP in your basement. So it's a major consideration for every industry. So that's number one, as Ron pointed out, is also the awareness. I think a lot of our customers actually don't know what's out there, what could be the alternative beyond what we have seen typically. And at Alectra Energy Solutions, we actually have a department, customer insight and acquisition group, who is very focused on talking to the customers, listening to their needs, understanding their concerns. So we have taken all of that in, Megan, and we recognize that not only it is a capital constraint issue, it's also a risk aversion issue that Ron pointed out. These assets require, taken care of. They require expertise in that domain. And you have to be comfortable to be able to deal with those assets on a long period of time. So there is an ownership risk involved. There is ongoing operation, maintenance, so on and so forth. So when I look at this, as an industry, you definitely want your energy to be an enabler, not be the sole focus of your day-to-day activity. You want energy to be coming out of black box, right? You flick the switch, it's there when you need it, and you flick it off when you don't need it. And that's how simple it should be. So recognizing that it's not as simple, at Alectra Energy Solutions, we've taken that in, and I think we have come up with a few different options and solutions that we feel could be very desirable for a lot of the industrial customers out there. So one of them being, at Alectra Energy Solutions would be prepared to deploy capital on behalf of the customer, and also take over the ownership, design, build, finance, maintain, operate option, potentially along with Tormont, to make sure that all of that financial risk is taken away from the customer, the upfront financial investment is taken away from the customer. The risk of ownership and operation is taken away from the customer. And the customers are actually just the beneficiary of the outcome of that product. So what we call it is, we term it energy as a service business model. And I think what's novel here is not so much the technology. The technology is well established, well tested, proven when it comes to reciprocating engines or CHP. But I think what's novel here is the business model, helping the customers to focus on their core competencies, as Ron pointed out, and taking that broader financial obligation, upfront capital investment, the operational risk, the ownership risk away from them, and helping them focus on their core business. The other thing I also want to point out is, although the global adjustment mitigation solutions, whether it's done through battery storage or natural gas engines, have been quite popular, simply because you have a very high incentive to pursue that. However, on the other hand, it's a solution that doesn't necessarily fit every single industry and customer class, right? It also comes with some inherent risks. If you are a data center, what flexibility you might have to shift peaks, you don't have a lot of flexibility. If you're cold storage facilities, right, or if you are a customer who has a very high base load requirement, under those circumstances, there are solutions available, self-generation solutions, which could be quite as competitive, if not more, on a long-term basis than the grid. You are self-reliant. It's in many ways, it's a great hedge against the electricity pricing and not have to deal with the market volatility where, one day you have pricing that are escalating, the other day you have pricing that are being clawed back, and then the pricing that, are escalating again. So for certain customer classes, it might be more beneficial to think about behind the meter prime power mode of operation, CHP type of units that can provide both heat and power, and overall can achieve great savings for them. Not only that, with on-site solutions, it's a potential backup as well. It also helps you with reliability, right? You're in control of the cost, and more than anything else, I think as a financial person from industry who are concerned about their long-term operating costs, you have a view into your future operating costs. You know exactly to a degree how much it's going to cost you, to generate electricity now, 5 years from now, so on and so forth. And given where the natural gas pricing is today and where it's trending in the future, it still is quite attractive to generate behind the meter.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Ammar. That's excellent. So that's the end of the questions that we had for the presentation, but we're going to move on to the Q&A portion. So Sharonjeet, Scott, we had a couple questions come in for registration as well as in our live chat. So Sharonjeet's going to direct those out to Ron or Ammar. Go ahead.
Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome.
We have questions from our participants. So the first one is, how will increased vehicle electrification affect future supply and pricing for electricity? So this is for both Ron and Ammar.
Sure, you want me to sort of jump off there, Ammar?
Sure, go ahead, Ron.
So historically, one of the challenges we do encounter is that there is a cost for what we'll call unused electricity, right? So we pay a price for low ebbs where we don't have the demand for the electricity that's out there. I think historically it was around $77 a megawatt that was being paid, and the value of the electricity at the time was $23. So effectively, if we have underutilized assets, we're going to continue to see an impact on the cost of electricity as a result of that. It's not going to help dissipate it because our demand is lowered. I think Ammar pointed out earlier as well that when there's lower demand, we still have to spread the debt out across the remaining participants. So if I'm down demand to 19 terawatts as opposed to 20 terawatts, somebody has to make up that capacity requirement and payment for the GA. So your electricity costs are not going to go down.
Thank you. Ammar, you would like to add anything to that?
Yeah, certainly. In addition to what Ron said, definitely there's a consensus, obviously, that if electrification of transportation will have a positive impact on the pricing, naturally, because if you're consuming more electricity, going back to the argument before, fixed system cost, more kilowatt hours being consumed, definitely there's an advantage. Now, however, if you look at the studies that have been done for Ontario, the rate of proliferation of EVs is still relatively mild. Even if you have, I believe, according to some study, 25% of all new vehicles being purchased are EVs, which is, by the way, a massive number. They still represent a very small fraction of the overall vehicle stock in Ontario. Remember, you still have vehicles that are on the road from 1990s and 1980s. They just do have a long lifespan. So whereas overall electrification of transportation would help, but more particularly, and this is actually getting into the nuances and people with operational backgrounds would appreciate this in the electricity industry, more than the kilowatt hour consumption that electric vehicles will bring about is basically the load on the system, being able to handle that quick spike when number of vehicles come on to charge on a distribution feeder and then they go out, actually will involve significant investments on the grid. So the jury is out if overall, that will lower the price of electricity in the province. There's definitely a short-term or immediate cost impact if we were to electrify, because according to a study in California, if 4 or 5 vehicles came online at the same time, it would trip off the distribution feeder.
Excellent. We have another question. How can customers use the existing standby generators to peak shave, and what kind of modifications are required to the existing installations?
So I'll take that from a technical perspective, and I apologize, guys. I misheard the first question there. So from the perspective of standby generator, it depends on what you have, first and foremost. If I have a diesel standby, it certainly can be used. If I have a natural gas standby, it certainly can be used as well. The critical piece will be it has to meet the ministry emission standards to be operated as a what we'll call a prime unit. So it will have to have emission control added to the asset. So in the form of a selective catalytic reduction system to reduce the NOx emissions from the engine. So there'd be a nominal cost depending on the size and not nominal, there'd be a cost associated with the size and scale of the engine and what technology has to be applied.
Thank you very much, Ron.
You're welcome.
Another question is, what sort of options are there for customers who have concerns about GHG emissions and or for carbon tax?
Do you want me to field that one as well, Ammar?
Sure, Ron, you go ahead and then I'll follow.
Sure. So there certainly is some concern with, particularly with the federal government pushing a carbon tax down the road. The impact in the GA market is going to be nominal and shouldn't really affect the project significantly in any way. If, as we spoke about earlier, it becomes a decision that I'm going to operate behind the meter on a more continuous basis, so many thousands of hours a year, then the carbon impact becomes consequential. Part of the challenge we have here in Ontario is that we're a very nuclear-based power, which means our base kilowatt from the grid is pretty clean already. So in spite of the fact that cogeneration or behind-the-meter generation can be very efficient, it does run a challenge here in Ontario coming up with a carbon benefit against the grid carbon kilowatt.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, I think it's a great question. I think it requires a bit of an in-depth discussion, because I think it's a very nuanced type of discussion. And oftentimes, if you're not looking at the right variables or with the right frame of operation, the result could be very different. So as Ron pointed out, if the desire is to leverage natural gas behind the meter for the purpose of peak mitigation, and the reason you would want to leverage natural gas is because you're not constrained by the discharge capacity of a battery, whether it's 2 hours or 2.5 hours or 3 hours. And there comes a point, I think, more than 2 hours where the business case or the economic don't make sense anymore unless the cost of battery drops significantly. So there's definitely a desire in the industry that we see from the customers to be able to leverage natural gas solutions for peak mitigation, because they also provide on-site backup and reliability. But then the concern of GHG is front and center. So, for the purpose of global adjustment, I think it's important to keep in mind these units would be dispatched maybe 150 to 200 hours, max 250 hours a year. And you would be dispatching these units during the times when you're anticipating a peak anyways. And one way to look at it is if you are dispatching these units during the peak hours, then typically peak hours within Ontario, you have natural gas generation on the grid, that gets dispatched. So you're not really compared against the baseload energy at that point, but you're really comparing against the GHG footprint that might be serviced by the natural gas generators, the gas features, as we call them. That's one view. But we recognize that some customers take comfort in that and other customers don't. For the customers who really want the global adjustment mitigation solution to be natural gas and also want it to be GHG neutral or free, for those customers, what we do is we do pair the natural gas solution with a small size solar capable of generating the equivalent kilowatt hours during the year, effectively providing you a net benefit.
Thank you, Ammar. The next question is, who would be in the best party to take the GA regulatory risk? The end user, the manufacturer behind the meter EPC provider, IC manufacturer, or the private PPA?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think the answer is everybody shares that risk. Definitely, it's not a risk that the government is underwriting. Government is providing an incentive through the ICI program, and people choose to participate in the ICI program through the means that they see most desirable to them. And as Ron pointed out, some customers may elect to simply curtail, and if it works for you, great. That's all you're doing. Some customers may go ahead and make certain investments on their own. Other customers may be working with third-party developers and owners and service providers. And so I think the risk is shared between the service provider as well as the customer. As an investor, if you're making an investment on behalf of a customer, providing them service, And if there are structural changes to the ICI program where those costs are difficult to recoup, it's difficult to imagine any financial investor to underwrite that risk. So I think the risk is shared between the customer and the service provider. However, I don't want to stop there, Sharanjit. I think it's important to remind, I think a lot of our customers that there are contractual mechanisms that at least Alectra Energy Solution provides, where we have the ability to switch those into capacity contract, enabling customers to generate effectively behind the meter, which largely mitigates a lot of that risk because the cost could be quite competitive.
Thank you, Ammar. I have one more question here. This is a question regarding cost pay of electricity, relative comparison of cost between diesel, natural gas, and utility. And maybe Ron, you could respond to this.
Sure. I figured somebody was going to ask us to come up with numbers here. It's a good question. The challenge of the question is it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string question. There's so many variables in defining that cost. So cost of a diesel versus the cost of a natural gas reciprocating engine is very different. The cost of the emissions mitigation will be different. The fuel consumption number will be very different between the two product lines. The size and scale of the project will be very impactful on the costs. So does a 400 kilowatt project compare to a 4,000 kilowatt project? And the answer is no. So we could have a variation anywhere between, $1,800 per megawatt to $3,000 per megawatt, depending on which of those solutions you pick and target. And the things that we have to look at, and it's critical when you look at these projects, and I'll go back to Ammar's point about the risk being shared. There's multiple aspects to the project that have to be taken into account and have to be thought about when you're putting it together. So there's a capital number, and it'll represent X cents per kilowatt generated. There is a fuel cost, and it'll be X cents per kilowatt at one level for natural gas, and it'll be larger X cents per kilowatt when I look at a diesel product. And then there will be what we call an operations and maintenance, an MRO number, and that has to be taken into account. These engines will operate. There will be things that have to be repaired, and so we have to take that into account in the number. And that all varies, when we look at the different scales and size of the project. So my MRO number is much better when I'm on a larger project than it is when I'm on a smaller project. My capital number tends to be better on a larger project than it is on a smaller project. And then the last piece is, one that's quite often forgotten. There is an administrative cost to embedding these projects. And again, a lawyer costs the same amount of money if I'm having them do some work for me on a 400 kilowatt as they do on a 4,000 kilowatt. So, you take all those pieces and it affects what that dollars per megawatt looks like on any given project. So, until we know the project in more specifics, it's hard to comment and give you a defined number of what it will be.
Thank you, Ron. We have a couple more questions, and that's great. If a large electricity consumer in Ontario is interested in exploring CHP or MES solution that would make economical sense, what are the next steps?
Do you want me to start, or are you?
Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
So the next steps. I'll look at it from two perspectives. The first is to just look at it as a self embedded system. We would like to understand what the site conditions look like. Some of the key aspects for us from a technical perspective would be, thermal demand versus electrical demand. Understanding the type of thermal, is it hot water, is it steam, volumes, pressures. So from a technical perspective, understanding what makes the best sense in terms of solution for the site. And once we know all that, we can come up with, what we'll call an initial plan, so a budget around or an understanding around what would be suitable for the site based on those high level assumptions. And when we understand those, then we can get into, we'll call it a thumbs up, thumbs down kind of approach. I like the sound of this. I now understand what my cost per kilowatt of electricity will look like. Do I want to proceed? Yes. Then we'll move into the next phase and we'll get into more detail. And then, from there we can get and refine the model until we know that we've got a really good project to go forward with. Careful steps at the beginning really help drive you in the right direction. And we understand what the budget's going to look like. I think that's the point in time where, you can say, hey, you know what, this is something that we think we would benefit from having someone take the risk, and we'll take the benefit that we get as a result of mitigating that risk. And we would engage in a conversation with Electra, say, as an MES partner, and then Ammar can talk to you about that MES aspect.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Ron. Roney, it's a great question. I think a lot of our customers obviously, have at some point in time thought about some of these solutions and don't really know where to begin. And, do they really need to create this substantial document, an RFP, run the full process, or could they just pick up the phone and call somebody and get the process started? I think there are a number of considerations that the customers have to take into account, a number of considerations that we as a solution providers have to take into account as well. The first question is, are you looking for a CHP solution because you're capacity constrained on the grid and you need to expand your production, and you don't have enough capacity available through your LDC, or you have massive capital contributions that you're being asked to front, or there is a 5-year delay until the grid can get built up to that level so that you can have your capacity and start building a new line, or new production line, or what have you. I think under those circumstances, a CHP type of solution or just electricity alone type of solution can be very, very beneficial for the customers, especially if you don't have to make any capital contributions up front. It just becomes a dollars per kilowatt hour type of price. Or if you're looking at it because you're looking for some cost savings of self-generation, then I think the next step really is to involve somebody like Alectra and Tormont. I would encourage everybody to visit our website, Tormont's website. We have Electra Energy Solutions website. Our CIA team is there to help you guide through every step of the way. But what we would do is we would start by understanding and analyzing your load profile, electrical, thermal, understanding. And look, our goal is that it needs to be on par or competitive in the long run than the grid pricing. And if it ends up being more expensive, then there really isn't any business case. Why would you pursue that, right? Unless you're capacity constrained. So this is where I think it's very important for us to start analyzing your load profile, understanding your future growth plans, understanding the facility footprint, understanding the available capacity on the grid, understanding available capacity in the natural gas grid, if you will, and then developing a technical solution as well as a financial solution catered to each individual customer's need, recognizing that you don't want to put upfront capital, recognizing that you want it to be competitive than the grid. So it's a bit of an involved process, but a process that we're happy to take on your behalf.
Thank you, Ron and Ammar.
At the end, I will say, don't wait, pick up the phone and engage someone who can help you with this.
Thank you. One more question. For the solar and natural gas combination, would solar directly feed back into the facility distribution, or would there be need for a battery storage system?
No, I think it will depend on each facility and the configuration thereof. It could be either or, but our goal would be to minimize the cost and have the solar feed directly into the facility. And look, we're only doing this just to offset the number of kilowatt hours you would generate, leveraging the natural gas solution for peak mitigation purposes so that you can be carbon free or even better than that. But if it requires a facility arrangement, then you need to have battery coupled with it. We will look at that.
Thank you very much. That was the last question.
All right, if anyone has any additional questions that weren't addressed here, please feel free to reach out to us. And we will definitely either engage Ammar, Ron, or anyone from our team to get those answered for you. So please don't be shy. And yeah, I guess that concludes Let's Talk Energy for today. So thank you to everybody on the call. We really, really appreciate it. And it was an excellent discussion, a lot of great information. So Ammar, Ron, thank you so much for your participation. And
Thanks.
yeah, we really
Thanks, Megan.
appreciate it. And as well, Sharonjeet and John for being a part of it, and to the rest of everybody on the call. Stay safe and stay tuned for another Let's Talk Energy session. We will be reaching out to you to let you know when the next one is. It may not be Ontario focused, so stay tuned for that. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Okay.
Yeah, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.